So what I want to talk to you today about is sort of Go from the broader perspective. None of us, unfortunately, in some cases, work in a bubble, and while that may be tragic, there are always other people you have to consider when you're writing code. This is kind of what Go gives people at large rather than just the individual developer. So a little bit about me. I have been a professional developer for a couple of years now. I'd only been writing web services for about 6 months before I was introduced to Go. And before that I had experience with Perl, Java, and I was looking into sort of non-blocking web applications. I was sold on Go pretty quickly, to be honest. It read to me like pseudocode, and it was the easiest language I've ever picked up. So I was really happy about it. But as I said, I'm only a single person, and in my case I was working in a larger organization, and you have other people to consider and different levels of structure within your development. And I quickly found that Go has things to offer a lot of people across that space. So to start with, management. It may sound insane, but Go as a programming language has a lot to offer management. I have, in my experience, found that managers often come up with what they think are simple requirements. They think that, you know, just saying we need to handle more traffic or we need to scale, that it's a simple word, it must be a simple process. And developers, by and large, don't always agree with that assumption. But so, as I was saying, you know, when you're working in a large organization, you don't have the luxury of saying, no, I'm going to write this. It's not that simple. I'll work to my own time frame. These decisions get made at a higher management level because they don't fully understand the technical process that goes into that. So, given that these simple requirements often lead to a complex implementation, we can see that there's this discrepancy already. Developers and managers are speaking a different language, and when technology is your product, that's not going to end well. So obviously, you know, to an extent everyone wants to, you know, please their manager, and if we could get more users, that'd be great. But to a manager, concurrency is often just a word, and it would be really great if perhaps management had a little bit more of a foot in the door of the technology they were asking people to develop in, or at least that there was a language that maybe required less time to pick up or was less terse to pick up, that maybe could give management or anyone outside of a technical space a sort of a frame of reference so that we can sort of break down those barriers between speaking different languages. So this is just a really quick cut of code that essentially shows how concurrency works in Go. Now, as Ian mentioned, concurrency is one of Go's major selling points. And managers love the word concurrency. Anyone thinks that, you know, what we need to do now is have multi-threaded processes and all these magical terms, but it's so much of a headache in so many places to actually implement this. In Go, say you have this routine, and it just says, I've put a wait in there, but you know, it can be any amount of processing of documents or whatever you want to do with it. You have a for loop and you're doing a job. Now, because this is a wait, you do that 10 times, you wait 2 seconds, it takes 20 seconds, right? Fairly straightforward script. If you add the word Go in front of it, you have what we call a Go routine, which basically means it's going to spin up a process to run in parallel. A Go routine is a fairly sort of naive concept, and it ran my whole process in tiny, tiny bits of a second. It didn't wait for that 2 seconds to return, because a Go routine just spawns a process. It doesn't wait for anything to come back. It just gives up and is like, oh, you doing that, I don't care, and then it just wanders off on its own. So that program's never going to cut it. That's not what we need it to do. But that's fairly simple, and I think if you were in a demo with a non-technical audience, you could say, you know, this is how you make a little bit of concurrency. But everyone would expect it to wait 2 seconds. And now all of a sudden, you've got these extra bits of logic coming into the equation. It's still fairly simple compared to a lot of other concurrent code out there in the world, but all you have to, there's a concept of a wait group in Go. So you call your wait group, you add one, so you say, I'm going to spawn one Go routine. Your Go routine goes off and does its thing. And after all 10 of those have been spawned, you have a wait. And what that means is this whole function isn't going to stop until it's got all of its counters back, because we've decremented them in our routine. And this takes the 2 seconds that you would expect it to take. So that's still a fairly simple script, and Go is still a very straightforward language to write this in. But from my experience, having this sort of more boiled down implementation of concurrency means that you can present that to non-technical audiences, to management, and say, look, it's pretty simple, but it gets really complicated really quickly, just in the logic, not in the implementation, because Go has distilled every idea down to its essence before it's been included in the core language. It's so important to the core team of Go developers that everything is so simple. And that's what I feel allows it to break down these barriers, that you can really simply implement these things. And to be honest, we're never going to completely break down this barrier. We're never going to have, in my experience, fully technical management or complete technical whizzes who could also run a business. Like, those are very rare gems in the world. But on a more realistic basis, if we can make it a little bit easier for developers to implement very complicated things, and a little bit easier for managers to understand that these are complex things, then maybe we can bridge that gap a little bit and bring people into speaking the same language. So, as I said, this is just a concurrency example. Go also handles testing, benchmarking, profiling, tons of other stuff in quite a straightforward way. So, as Ian showed you, there's a core package to handle testing that does a fairly decent job. There's built-in benchmarking, there's built-in profiling with like GUIs that you can spin up for any application in Go, and it's all part of the core language. This presentation is written using part of the core language called Present. It has so many tools in it that aren't just for developers, it's for a pipeline and for an organization and for a group of people trying to achieve a technical goal. But so yeah, as I've said, these are all things that Go doesn't just give you, it gives you them in a very simple way, which I feel is one of its biggest selling points. Ian mentioned this earlier, that the language has been around for 6-7 years, and they released Go 1.7 recently. They released Go 1.71 on the 7th of September, Ian. But I feel like this is a really important sort of metric to have about the community, that not only is Google invested in, as far as I understand it, a globally distributed Go team, this still has the weight of Google behind it as a language, but also it's so open source, and they really embrace the open source spirit. They want contributions from everyone. So it has the weight of Google behind it, but the speed of an open source community and the speed of hundreds of people contributing to this library. So you're never going to be in a situation where you go, oh, well, this language is deprecated, or this version isn't supported, and there's a Go 1 compatibility promise. They will never change anything in Go 1 that is not backwards compatible, as far as I understand it. I might have that technically a little bit wrong, but they're pretty solid on they don't want to break your applications. And I feel like that's a really important selling point to an organization. As a single developer with a single app, you can go through and rewrite things on occasion if you have to. At scale, that's so much more challenging. And the fact that you have a language that's being so quickly developed is such a selling point. I've taken this statistic from the keynote at Golang UK, which was about a month ago, by a woman called Carlicia Campos, and she was talking about the community around Go. And there's a Go for Slack channel that Ian also mentioned, and there's, I think, a couple thousand users on there now, maybe 1,000 and a bit. But you can see 49% of the total messages are direct messages. So if you're trying to do something in Go and you're using a third-party library, chances are the person that wrote that library is probably on there, because that's the way the community works. Everyone is involved. But also chances are, if you've got a problem with it, you can message them directly and get feedback and get help, because that, again, is just the way the community works. So many of these messages are one-to-ones and people reaching out and getting help. And I think that's a really important thing, to have that confidence behind a language, that it's not this little tool off in a corner that no one can help you with. It is so widely used. Also, developer velocity. It's really important, obviously, that as a group of developers you can work in a fairly efficient way and move forward in a good way. And in my experience, people who pick up Go, particularly people who are already developers, you can pick up the syntax of Go in less than a few days. You can be writing production quality code in Go in less than a fortnight. I've never heard of a language that is so quick to pick up, and that all comes down to the size of the Go core library. Ian showed you, you can do so many things just with the core library, and that is really another one of Go's major selling points, that you don't need all of this extraneous stuff. You don't need to know about every third-party library that exists. If you know the core library, at the very least you can get by. You can probably write some very performant code without a lot of difficulty. So from the perspective of management, from the perspective of non-technical people, this means that it's easy to get new starters in your organization up to speed. It means that if you want to move someone from one project to another, if both of those pieces of code are written in Go, chances are they can pick up that new piece of code fairly quickly, because hopefully you've written some idiomatic code. In Go, that means you probably have documentation, and as Ian mentioned, you use Go format. So it's nothing in there is going to break your focus, because it's all well-written code. So yeah, that's just from the perspective of management. But then, when we start talking about how you write code, and this Go format and idiomatic, we start talking about actual developers on the ground. But I think it's really important to talk about developers as a group. So in your organization, you might have a scrum, you might have a couple scrums. But none of those people are going to be working in isolation. And I think it's so important to realize that Go prioritizes a few of these things to make Go a language that works at scale, not just for programming at scale, but for working at scale with other people. So writing clear and concise code is really like the bottom line for idiomatic code. If you can read it and it's practically spoken word to you, then you've probably written some clear and concise code. If you've got all sorts of messiness and you read it and you go, oh, then you've not written idiomatic code, I can tell you that right now. The other really important thing about idiomatic Go code is that every exported function has to be documented. And I think this is the most, I'm like nuts for documentation. I think if something's not well documented, I'm not going to use it, because how am I supposed to understand it? With Go, you've written clear and concise code, so if I wanted to, I could read your source code, I could probably pick it up. But if you've really written idiomatic code, you've documented it, so I don't need to read your source code because I know exactly what it does out of the box. I'm going to talk a little bit about operations. I'm going to mention support and DevOps, and I don't really want to have a naming discussion with you. If you don't like DevOps as a term, then like that's okay. Fundamentally speaking, all code at some point would like to see the light of day. It probably needs to be deployed in some way. At some point it may need to be supported. So I'm just using some catch-all terms. It's okay. So from a support perspective, you may or may not have a support team who aren't necessarily full-time programmers, but have a basis of technical skill. The thing I really love about Go is how easily you can transfer actual Go code from your actual application, cut in a line or two, and give your support guys a script that does something for you. So in my experience, I've used this for generating IDs. So given, a string of a user's name, and then it generates some fluff and it gives you a different unique ID, you can give that script to a support user and it's just a binary they can run whenever they like. It's literally as simple as going from this code that we were running earlier. Say that we were actually passing in a number of seconds. You parse some flags from the command line, and now your support users just need to pass in this flag that says how many seconds they want that to run for. And now they can utilize huge chunks of your code themselves whenever they want. This whole thing here, from go run to .go, can be, if you use go install, builds down to a binary that you can put in your Go bin. So Ian was showing you this bin source package structure earlier. You put it in your bin, and it's just an executable. You can just use it as a command. So you could just say timer seconds equals 5. And your support users all of a sudden have so many more tools than they might not have had previously. From a DevOps perspective, I think this is really where a lot of organizations get introduced to Go nowadays, because Ian already told you. We have all these examples, and the one thing that a lot of these things have in common is they tend to be used in the DevOps space. So Kubernetes, Terraform, etcd. etcd uses something called a raft protocol that is written in Go. Prometheus is a really heavy hitter in Go as well. And I found this really interesting article from, I think, a really interesting quote from a Puppet article about how their experience of aligning their tool chain made them so much more efficient. You have all of these new tools coming into the space you're working in. So you've got Docker coming in, and you've got Terraform coming in. Your DevOps people are probably going to want to understand some basics of how that kind of stuff is working. Chances are they've looked through some source code. Chances are they've got Go rattling around somewhere in their environment. But if you want an efficient tool chain, then that needs to spread. And the one thing I think Go does really well is reach all of these different platforms in different ways, and it draws different people in the ways that matter to them. This is one, it might seem a little crazy to talk about HR in a tech talk, but I think this is really important. I personally feel that a working environment, particularly in a tech world, is only as good as the environment, the people it contains, are immersed in outside of work. And in a lot of cases, as much as developers are a stereotype, and technical people might be quite a generic term, a lot of people who work in these spaces will be involved in online communities outside of work. The Gopher community, I feel, is a sterling one to be involved with because of the commitment they make to being good people. So they have a Go code of conduct. A lot of Go conferences offer diversity scholarships. There is an entire Slack team for an organization called Women Who Go. There is a different organization called Go Bridge that offer training to minority and underrepresented groups in the community. And I feel like if say you start using Go, and all of a sudden you're asking questions in the Go for Slack or in the Google group, and you're communicating with all of these people to whom diversity and being a good person is such an important thing, then I think that has to have a knock-on effect in your own society, in your own department. And I think that's a really good thing to aim for. And as much, I don't know of any languages that set out to be bad people, but I think that's the real difference, is that Go sets out to be good people. And it's a refreshing take on the world that, as I've said, Go doesn't just want to work for developers as individuals. It wants to work for your entire organization. It wants to appeal to management, deliver the goals they need. It wants to be efficient for developers to write, efficient for developers to use. It wants to take the hassle out of your pull requests because you never have to have a conversation about spaces or tabs again. And it wants to be the language that you use to deploy everything and support it. And also the people are great. I am definitely not an advocate that one tool is right for all jobs.